So we can start. I'm so happy to be talking about young adult tonight with everyone. All right, wonderful. So let's jump right into young adult writing and critiquing. So first off, I just want to go over the agenda really quick. We're going to do just an introduction, some housekeeping, and then I'm going to jump right into the young adult fundamentals, basically defining the young adult genre. Then we're going to look at plot, character, and world, the big three of fiction and how they apply to young adult. And then finally, we're going to cover the YA critiquing community. And then last but definitely not least, we're going to do a live Q&A session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A and I will get to them right away. So just some housekeeping. Please stay muted to avoid background noise. You have two ways to participate during the live Q&A. You can click the raise hand icon to speak, or you can type your question into the Q&A box. And if I don't get to your question, we will definitely have ways of staying in contact afterwards, so you can ask it then. So I already had a wonderful introduction. I just wanted to add that I am a member of the Writers League of Texas and SCBWI, so I have a lot of experience in different critiquing organizations, so hopefully I can help you guys out with the critiquing side of young adult as well as the writing. So without further ado, let's jump right into the young adult fundamentals. So I'm sure you've probably heard some of this. I'm certain you haven't heard all of it. We're just going to look at the basics of young adult, and we're also going to talk a little bit about some age-appropriate content and how we define that. So I want to start you off with young adult by the numbers. As I'm sure all of you know, young adult is the genre for teenagers. So your protagonists are going to be teenagers, and your target audience, the people you think you're writing for, are going to be teenagers. But I did want to show you this side of young adult as well, which is the publishing side. So as you can see, this information is a little bit dated, but young adult has more than doubled in the number of titles from 2002 to 2012, and that trend continues. So I'm going to repeatedly say during this discussion that young adult is a flooded marketplace, and that's kind of what I mean. There's pros and cons to this really quickly growing part of the publishing industry, and we're going to talk about how those are going to impact your writing. I also want to turn your attention to the current YA book purchases by age. So your target audience for young adult is those teenagers, right? We expect to be writing for anywhere from 10 and up, right? But if you look at the people who are actually buying young adult books, that's only 16% of the people buying the books. So as we go through this presentation, I'm going to give you some tips on really creating a story that's going to interest those older audiences as well, because a lot of people 18 to 29 also read young adult, and they need a more complex story to kind of keep them interested. So first, I want to jump into the bare bones of YA, the very basic parts of it. So young adult is most often 60,000 to 80,000 words long. It can range from 50,000 to 90,000. As you can see in this chart on the left, you cannot be confusing your young adult word counts with middle grade and adult fiction. So your middle grade fiction is those books for elementary age kids, so anyone who's not learning to read but hasn't quite reached the young adult level, and those are going to be much shorter than young adult. So if your book is starting to wind up on the short side, it might be better suited to middle grade. And as you can see, adult fiction, on the other hand, winds up being much longer than young adult. So if it's on the long end, you could be winding up in the adult age range. So obviously these word counts are just general guidelines, but when you're outside of them, it does tend to indicate a flaw in your project. So for example, if you're above that 90,000 word limit, it could mean that you're including information, scenes, maybe world building that you don't actually need to advance your story. And if you're below that 50,000 words, it could be that you don't have the character complexity and development that's characteristic of young adult. So those are just things to watch out for if your book is a little bit outside of that range. Young adult can also be divided into mature and older young adult and young YA subgenres. So you're never really going to use those terms to pitch your work. So if you are someone who's looking for an agent or an editor, you're not going to go up to them and tell them that you're writing them young YA. However, it's an important distinction for you as the author to know, and a lot of people in the YA community use it because it can help separate your book. As you saw, we do have a huge number of older readers who read YA. So it can help kind of define which audience your book is marketed towards. So those mature, older YA books are going to have older protagonists, and they're going to have a lot more complexity, maybe some more graphic content, and they're going to be kind of angled more towards those older readers, those 18 to 29-year-olds who are really into YA. Young YA, on the other hand, probably going to have younger protagonists, going to be more focused on loss of innocence maybe, or maturity, things like that. Maybe a little bit less complexity, definitely less graphic content. So that's just something to think about in the back of your mind, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more as we go. But for now, I want to move on to the structural part of young adult. So first person present tense is the most common way that people write young adult. Third person is also pretty common, especially in fantasy and science fiction, those very speculative kind of genres. And that's because first and third person limited allow you to get into your protagonist's head. And if you think about it, your main character in young adult is someone who's going through this transformative experience in their life, right? They're growing up, they're trying to understand who they're going to be and how they fit into the world. So you really need to be in a close perspective to get that from your main character. That being said, Omniscient, the one we haven't dealt with yet, in which you have a third-person narrator who is not your main character telling us this story, typically doesn't work for young adult, but obviously there are exceptions that prove the rule. For example, The Book Thief is one of the most popular young adult books ever, and that is told in Omniscient. So generally, though, if you're starting out, I would recommend first person or third person. I also want to talk to you a bit about structural things that you decide to do in your book. So unusual structure, your flashbacks, your jumps in time, your different perspectives, as well as prologues, are typically not recommended unless they clearly serve your story. Confusing structure can be detrimental to your inexperienced readers, you know, those 10-year-olds who are picking up young adult for the first time because it's hard to follow. Also, a note about prologues, because there is a huge taboo in the young adult publishing industry about prologues, and that's because most people think they need to hook their younger audiences with some intense action or something shocking or something dramatic. And so that is what they make their prologue, when in fact you hook your readers by creating empathy with your main character. So just something to keep in mind in case you're considering a prologue. Does it really serve your story? Does it advance your plot? All right, next up, age-appropriate content. And this gets an entirely different slide because it's a huge deal in young adult. So your target audience, as I've said, is 12 and up. Readers as young as 10 enjoy young adult. So do a lot of adults. So you do have this unique challenge of trying to create something complex without freaking out those younger audiences. So some of the main gatekeepers for young adult, because it is really targeted towards teenagers, is going to be your librarians, your parents, your teachers, those authority figures who are going to say, this book doesn't fly. And it's important to know what the gatekeepers are looking for, because that's really going to affect what's appropriate for this genre, what is okay and what isn't. So surprisingly enough, violence is almost never censored. However, language and romantic content is censored like crazy. For example, we had less than 50 books in my local library branch who were censored for violence in the past year. Comparatively, less than 100 were censored for nudity. Language, on the other hand, more than 3,000 books were censored for language. So if you're thinking about using curse words or hate slurs, I highly recommend that you don't. unless it like really adds something to your story, because that is the quickest way to make your book no longer appropriate for a teenage audience. I also want to encourage you to focus on impact and emotional resonance, not graphicness. So if you're trying to figure out if you want to include violence or you want to include romantic content, think about, would it be similarly emotionally resonant with your readers if you included something that was less graphic? For example, could you have two characters just hold hands instead of taking it to second base or something? And would that have the same resonance with your readers? Because if it would, then you should go the high road and avoid that graphic content, because that's always just going to work better in young adult, right? You don't want to freak out any readers, but you do want to deliver that emotional resonance. So you aren't writing Game of Thrones. We all love Game of Thrones. There's a lot of great TV shows and book series that have come out in the adult market recently that follow the same thing that Game of Thrones started, which is using graphic content to shock people into continuing to watch. And while that works out really, really well with adult audiences, it's not really appropriate for your young adult audiences, because, again, you're trying to avoid that graphic content, trying to focus on impact and emotional resonance. So never use something graphic to shock your audience. I also am going to encourage you to be realistic to your own experiences as a teenager, because, and this is particularly true if you're writing that young YA stuff, which is why those subgenres are important to know, right? If you have a 15-year-old protagonist, they probably shouldn't be dating someone in college unless you acknowledge that that's not a normal relationship, because the readers of those younger YA books tend to be like 10 to 12-year-olds, maybe 13-year-olds, these younger kids who are really looking to find out what they're going to get out of their teen years, and you don't want to give them the wrong impression. Okay, if you have any questions over this section, please drop them in the Q&A, because for now, we're going to move on to those big three: plot, character, and world. So plot, that's the big one, right? You want to establish your protagonist's goal immediately. And this may seem counterintuitive, but if you can literally spell out your protagonist's goal, it's going to benefit those less experienced readers, because it's something that they can grab onto and be aware of throughout the rest of the book. So if your character wants to go to prom, but prom is canceled, then literally tell us in the first pages she wants to go to prom. Because that's just going to help that teenage audience connect right away to what's going to motivate your plot. Protagonists should also reflect and evolve throughout your plot. So this is a huge thing in young adult that isn't there in middle grade fiction, books for younger readers, right? Because this is a time in their life where, we're all either living through our teen years or have experienced them, right? So we know that it is a time of change and a time of growing into who you are. So that is a huge part of any young adult story. And if your story is maybe missing some of that reflection, that could be one of the reasons that it's not fitting that well in young adult. So just be aware of that and think about how your protagonist can transform and what they can reflect on and what can affect them. I also want to point out that young adult tends to have a fast-paced plot, even the literary young adult books out there. It's just a norm of the genre, because those younger readers really like to fly through pages. You know, you have to keep the attention span of 10-year-olds, even if you're entertaining an older audience as well. And I don't know about you guys, but when I was 10, if something wasn't happening every chapter, I was not down. So a great way to keep your book fast-paced is to think of your scenes as subplots, right? So I'm sure we all know the classic plot structure, right? You have rising action, tension builds as your protagonist tries to get something or do something, and obstacles are thrown in their way. You have the climax, and then you have either a cliffhanger, some falling action that resolves the climactic event, right? So if you view your scenes this way, as well as your entire book, it can help you get the faster pace that's normal in young adult, because what you're basically doing is creating an event within each scene, right? So think of your scene as a conflict is building, tension is gathering, and then at the end of the scene, some climactic event happens that leads into your next scene. I also want to point out that young adult has a more complex plot than middle grade fiction typically. I'm sure we have all read the Rick Riordan books. If you haven't, check them out because they're a great example of a middle grade plot, right? It's pretty straightforward. The main character knows what they want and they go after it. Young adult, on the other hand, needs some twists and turns. You need to kind of throw some things in the face of your protagonist that make them really question what's going on. Because that's going to be expected from those older readers, right? Those 18 to 29-year-olds. Plots often include family. Adult fiction doesn't usually include your family, but in young adult, you know, these teenage protagonists are still like processing growing up, right? So their family should be involved. And it also typically includes ramifications beyond the protagonists themselves, though not always. Those are called your stakes, right? What happens if your protagonist fails? And the higher you make the stakes, the more tense your plot is going to be. So I do want to point out, if you're just starting out in young adult, the hero's journey works very, very well for young adult. And we're going to take a look at that on the next slide. So this is Ingrid Sundberg's Archwalk Structure. I highly recommend that you Google it and print it out and put it on your wall like I did. This is way too detailed for me to talk about too much here tonight with you, but I do want to point out that this is the hero's journey. There are other plots out there and other possibilities. The hero's journey, however, works really well with young adults. So again, if you're starting out, this is a great place for you to start. So as you can see, you have the ordinary world where your protagonist is at. Something happens to call them onto an adventure, which is, you know, I mean, we all had adventures as teenagers, right? So that's a great part of the teenage experience. And then on this adventure, your protagonist or your hero encounters tests, allies, enemies. They are challenged. They learn about the world around them, which is great to kind of increase the character's maturity, things like that. And then you have the inmost cave, which I often think of as the moment when the villain almost seems to triumph, right? And then after that, your protagonist tends to have like a heroic final push where they grow and develop into a new person, maybe overcoming some flaws they had in the beginning. That's what gets them to the climax where they win. And then we have some return with the elixir stuff, which is your falling action, right? Your protagonist returns to their life as it was before, but they see it differently because they are a different person, which again works really well with that coming of age theme that you see a lot in young adults. So I'd highly recommend that you check this out online. All right, on to character. So your characters, and this is particular to your protagonist, needs a name, a signature look, backstory, clearly defined flaws, and a developmental arc. Some of you may be wondering where that flaws part is coming from because it seems like a perfect character would be most likable, but it turns out the opposite is true. If your character is deeply flawed, readers of your book can empathize with them because they see kind of the human failures that they have in themselves in that character. And flaws lend themselves to that developmental arc, right? So throughout your book's plot, your character, especially your protagonist, you could have a side character go through a developmental arc, but primarily your protagonist, they're really going to change as a person. They're going to grow and develop based on the experiences that they have in the book until like right around the time of your climax. Maybe they grow past some of those flaws they had before. Maybe they realize some things they never knew, and that helps them achieve their ultimate goal. So focusing in on the young adult protagonists, they tend to be 15 to 18 years old, but they can be as young as 12 or 13. And that protagonist age directly correlates to young YA or mature YA subgenres. So if you do have a younger protagonist, then they're probably not going to be engaged with super graphic content. You know, they probably aren't having sex or killing people or anything like that. Your mature characters, on the other hand, have a little more leeway for that. Alternately, your mature characters are, you know, those 18-year-olds, they're really going to have a lot of complexity and a lot of development. So that's a really good way to tell which subgenre you fall into, and then base the content in your book off of that. Protagonists must also exhibit complexity. So your young characters aren't always naive. You know, they can be smart in certain ways, and in fact, they probably should be. But keep in mind that no matter what their age is, a dimensional character, your main character, should be imperfect, internally conflicted, and introspective. They need to have conflict inside of them. They need to have noticeable flaws, and they need to be somewhat self-aware, right? And that's going to create a main character that feels real and that your audience can root for. So I highly recommend that if your character does not have any noticeable flaws in your current book, that you take a second look and find ways of making them feel a little more human. So protagonists also tend to be hopeful rather than disillusioned. If you're writing like the cynical detective who's seen it all, that's probably an adult book, because young adult protagonists have their futures ahead of them. No matter how dire their straits may be, that tends to be a hopeful thing because they know that they have potential to change maybe the world around them or maybe themselves. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Also, your adult characters are in the background in young adult. This is a story about teenagers. Your protagonist should be a teenager. Most of your supporting characters should be teenagers. And if you do have adults, resist the urge to have the adult jump in and save the day at the last minute, because this is a teenage story. So next, we're going to look at worlds. So I talked earlier with the very first infographic that we saw about YA being a flooded market, right? It's this part of the publishing industry that is expanding incredibly fast, and new titles are being added all the time. New authors are being discovered. And while that's great for us because we have a lot of potential to break into this market, it can be dangerous when it comes to your world building, because there are so many new titles being released right now that they're starting to look a little bit similar. So one great way of setting your world aside from others is to embrace maybe an ethnicity, maybe a diversity that other people have not embraced before. I highly recommend that you read Anna-Marie McLemore's Wild Beauty and Weight of Feathers. Both of them play heavily on her Hispanic heritage. And they both have magical elements, but they're both, one at least, is set in the real world. And it's really interesting because it sets her book aside, and it's one of the things that made her stories successes. I also want to encourage you to treat setting like it's a character and plays a role in your plot. So how does the environment around your character affect the central conflict of your story? This is not as much of a thing in adult fiction, but when it comes to YA, younger protagonists are shaped by their environments. So you can't think of your setting as a play's backdrop, right? Like some unmoving prop pieces that don't do anything or interact with your characters, because your protagonist is directly influenced and their actions are influenced by the world around them because they're still understanding how they fit in that world. So a great example of this would be Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give. If you haven't read it, again, I highly recommend that you do. The main character's entire journey is shaped by the Black community around her and the police brutality that that community has experienced, which is very impactful because it influences the main character so much. And that's not something we see very often in fiction, but it is something that needs to happen more in young adult fiction. For my speculative people out there, my fantasy and science fiction authors, I also want to advise you to focus on logistics as well as beauty. This is one of the flaws in world building that can really mess up an author, is if you don't include some of the logistical parts of the fantastical world elements that you introduce, right? So if you have a spaceship, You probably don't need to explain to us how it reaches warp speed, but you may want to explain, does it have fuel? Does it need fuel? Does it have to stop over at places to get, cleaned or something? Things like that will lend some realness to your world. So I just wanted to give you guys that little note. So that concludes our big three. And now we're going to look at critiquing young adult. So how the YA critiquing community interacts with each other and how it's different from other critiquing communities, as well as some golden critiquing rules. So the golden rule of critiquing is to be kind but be thorough. And this applies no matter what genre you're writing in, right? Because you have to remember that you are here to help another writer on their journey. So if your critique is too harsh, if you don't at least take into consideration how they may feel after receiving your feedback, you may discourage them. And that's really, really sad because, you want to be encouraging them. You want them to take the next step in their writing journey. But you also want to be thorough. Don't be too scared of being mean to not include a critique when it's needed, because that is going to harm your partner more than help them. I also want to encourage you, and again, this is the second golden rule, which applies to any genre. Ask yourself why you don't like characters, plot elements, world building, etc. in your partner's work, and explain your critiques. If you get a partner who just says, I didn't like this, it's not typically that helpful, right? So part of critiquing is not only thinking about that other person that you're critiquing for, but thinking about yourself and going, why am I reacting to this part of the story in this way? If you can explain that to your partner, it's going to help them avoid making the same mistake in the future. And that's where you get the real growth in someone's writing journey. I also want to remind you that YA's boundaries are continually expanding. So again, taking it back to that first infographic I showed you that really illustrated how YA is just exploding right now. 30 years ago, YA hardly existed, and it definitely wasn't what it is now. So if you see something in your partner's work that you've never seen before, go at it with an open mind, because this is the fastest growing part of the publishing industry. And that is going to affect the work we start seeing. And as writers, I encourage you to think of the same thing, right? How can you make your book stand out? And how can you push the boundaries of what we've done so far in YA? So another note for critiquing, YA is the most diverse age range. So out of all of the parts of the publishing industry, YA includes the most LGBTQ+ and ethnically diverse characters. So that diversity is just part of the identity of this genre. So if you see a partner with a diverse character, make sure they're representing diversity appropriately. Most people who read YA know quite a bit about different sexual orientations or maybe different cultures because they've been exposed to these books that include them. So help your partners out with that, because that's sometimes hard to see when you're the one writing. Also, and this is another of those golden rules, look for a complex protagonist and an easily identifiable plot. If after reading 3 to 5 chapters from your partner, you can't identify their plot and you can't say what their protagonist's inner conflict is, then it's not working, because those things should be something you can tell right off the bat, right? That's how you keep readers reading, is the promise of the continuation of that plot and the intensity of that conflict within the protagonist. So be looking for those and be ready to help your partner if you can't find them. I also have some tips for Critique Match, which is pretty different from those other critiquing platforms out there. First of all, be polite. That goes pretty much anywhere. But I also encourage you to message your partners. The great thing about Critique Match that not every site does is that you're able to start a conversation with your critique partner, and that can often be the place where you create some of your best critiques. And where you get the best feedback for your personal story is when you open those dialogues and really discuss, what do you think I should do with this? Or did you like this part of it? So be sure to message and start that conversation. I also suggest that you send a chapter before you send your manuscript. Especially in young adult, you can run into some manuscripts that just aren't YA. I mean, a lot of people fall into this age range accidentally and maybe should be writing adult fiction or should be writing middle grade fiction. So if you get a chapter first, you can inform your partner of things like that. You can also tell if you are going to be the best person to help with your partner's writing, or if you like their critiquing style, things like that. So I highly recommend that. And then last of all, don't be expecting professional feedback unless you hire a pro critiquer. That's why Critique Match set up that program, right? So your unpaid partners are learning their craft as well, and they may not be the best at critiquing yet. They may still be figuring out how to do that. So again, if you're looking for professional feedback, go to a pro. So that is all I have for critiquing, guys. So now let's jump into the live Q&A part of this. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that I can see all of your fantastic faces and be able to access the Google Meets. All right. So I'm already seeing some questions here in the Q&A. First off, are there exceptions to the 90,000 word upper limit for YA for genres like historical fiction specifically? So absolutely, there are exceptions. And I mean, I have some sitting on my bookshelf right there. But typically when you get these exceptions, it's because there's something in the book that makes it necessary to have a higher word count. So if you have multiple protagonists, that's one way that you can wind up with a much higher word count, just because that is more natural to include everything in the story, right? If you have a really epic storyline, so especially in historical fiction, if it's told across a massive time frame, something like that, that's another way that you would get a higher word count. I just encourage you, if you do have one of those higher word counts, to go back through your book and reread everything and ask yourself if it's necessary, because that's one of the ways that you can get a higher word count that isn't as great. So yeah, let's see. How many scenes can be in a chapter before it becomes too long or condensed? That's a good question. So I would recommend taking it back to what I was talking about with scenes being subplots before, expanding that to your chapter. If all of the scenes in your chapter serve the same subplot, right, they're building towards the same incident or plot advancement moment, then they should be there. If you wind up with a ton of scenes that aren't contributing to that same goal or same conflict, then they may not be as natural in that chapter. I mean, it's hard to say without seeing your scenes, but generally speaking, I would recommend 4 would be my maximum for me personally. As a writer, I wouldn't put more than 4 scenes in the same chapter because that can get overwhelming. All right. And we have a question in the chat. So, new adult. Oh boy. Okay. So, first of all, I do want to address new adult as a genre. So this question asks, does the new adult age group have a word count between YA and adult? So new adult is really just mature YA. And that's not my personal opinion, I promise. As was said in my introduction, I have been taking masterclasses with industry professionals. We've discussed new adult. Most people don't consider it separate from YA anymore. But I would say that if you're writing new adult, it's going to be natural for you to have those word counts that are a little bit higher, closer to 70 to 90K, just because, like I was saying, when you have a lower word count, it's because you don't have as much character development. In new adult, you tend to have a lot more character development, so you're going to wind up with one of those higher word counts. But it's not going to probably go too far outside the YA range because they're pretty similar. All right, tips for writing a YA morally gray character who you want the reader to find likable despite some of their questionable actions. So, first of all, I would recommend that no matter how morally gray your character is, you do give them some moments when they make an empathetic decision, you know, something kind, or, you know, a moment like when readers understand that they do have goodness inside of them. I'd also recommend that their character motivation is not negative, because that is the quickest way to get a morally gray character likable. For example, say that a person wants to save their sister, and so they do some very morally gray things in order to achieve that goal. It's still a good goal because they're trying to save someone else, right? And it's so that's a really good way to get a morally gray character to be likable, is just by throwing in some good parts to them, right? Not just bad ones. And again, especially in YA, you want to have characters who are really hopeful. So those morally gray characters, that's another great way to make them likable, is if they are very hopeful. Okay, I have some other questions that you guys sent in before we registered and had the full event, so I want to address some of those as well. So what is a quality or theme that readers are most looking for in young adult? So as we discussed earlier, that theme of maturity and growing up, coming of age is a theme that you're going to hear over and over in young adult. And that's because it's really direct to the teenage experience, right? So coming of age basically means, what does maturity and growing up look like, right? When does this character become an adult? And is it loss of innocence? Is it gaining knowledge? Like, what does that transformation look like? So if you're looking for straightforward themes for YA, that is one that works very frequently. Okay, I'm seeing another question in the Q&A. Any other story structures that occur in YA? Absolutely. And if you're looking for more story structures, I'd recommend you check out 20 Master Plots, because those have 20 plots, as they imply. You can pretty much get any story structure to work in young adult, but I would recommend the hero's journey if you're starting out, just because that one is really easy to do in YA. If you have a specific story structure that you were wondering about, we can talk about that too, if you'd like to unmute or put that in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
Yes, please.
All right, what were you thinking for story structure?
I was thinking something more geared towards romance.
Okay, yeah, that can absolutely work in YA. So that is actually, I would recommend that you check out some contemporary YA romances, because those are great. You could even look at, I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. Hush is a great romance as well. And romances work pretty well in young adult. Though be aware that your characters are young. So while that plot structure is going to work, part of that plot is probably going to have to be them kind of learning a little bit more about themselves and about each other, and about how, you know, relationships can develop, just because they may not be knowledgeable about that yet. But yeah, romance would be great. let me just answer a couple more of these preliminary questions for you guys. So I had a very specific question. Low-level or unexplained occult or ritual practices, are they a taboo subject in YA manuscripts, and would they be unacceptable to gatekeepers? So we did talk a lot about age-appropriate content and what those gatekeepers are looking at. I would caution you, though, if you are doing rituals, be careful about making them satanic in nature, because that is one thing that some parents would object to, you know, because that is like immediately something that a certain type of household would want their kid not reading. So just be conscious of that. But yeah, rituals should be fine for young adult. All right, does anyone else have any questions? Anything you just wanted to chat about? Yeah, and if you guys need any of the infographics or maybe the plot structure that I put in the slides, feel free to reach out to me on Critique Match if you can't find those online yourself, just through a quick Google. All right, writing books that I would recommend. So for me personally, that's tough. I mean, I already mentioned that 20 Master Plots is a great book if you're just looking at different plot structures. But if you've already picked out your plot structure, that might not be that useful, because it's mainly good during those stages when you're still trying to decide which direction you want to take your story and things like that. I would also recommend Writer's Digest Handbook on how to write a novel, because that is a very massive reference book. If you'll excuse me for 1 second, I will go grab it off my bookshelf and show you guys what it looks like so you can find it. All right, sorry to disappear on you. So this is what it looks like. It's called The Complete Handbook of Novel Writing. It's very, very big, and it has so much helpful advice in here. For those of you who don't know, Writer's Digest is a very long-running literary magazine, so it's mainly from their editors and some contributing writers. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that one. It's not specific to young adult, unfortunately, but most things aren't. So yes. Did anyone else want to discuss anything about their story? Because if not, I might let you all go. Thank everyone for being here. It's nice to see you all.